All right, it should be, oh, really?
Yeah, it's just.
That makes me feel very important.
Yeah.
So it should be good,
Okay.
like it's open and running.
No, I think.
Even if it's just wait for.
We are recording. Yeah. What did you say is on record?
So I just wanted to say that we're going to start in about 5 minutes. The plenary in the other room is sort of running over a little bit, and so might expect a few more people to come in. And I'm expecting one of the panelists for this panel to join via Zoom, and they hadn't shown up yet. So, things are up in the air. But we'll start in 5 minutes to show. And we've already got 3 of our wonderful panelists here already. So yeah, hang tight for 5 minutes.
I'm gonna mute again.
I think he's he wants to see the asked you to they asked him for the manuscript. I was like, no.
I don't gave him anything because he almost asked for it, but he also said like super I think he needs still
There's still no.
So I just basically
No name tag.
I'm done after this.
Oh, tonight.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's true.
Oh, okay. You can come stay with me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Sort of helpful. What are we doing?
All right, we're about to get started here. And there's a little difficulty with one of our panelists who hasn't joined the Zoom room. They were expected to, but we're going to get started anyway. This is a panel on money and social relations. It's broadly titled because it comes put together from individual paper submissions that we had, which were amazing. And the 3 speakers that we have over here today are Terri Friedline, Anush Kapadia, and David Wishnick. Anush is an associate professor of sociology at IIT Bombay. David is associate professor of law at Georgetown, and Terri is associate professor of social work at U Michigan. And my name is Sannoy. I'm an SJD candidate here at the law school, and I have the great privilege of acting as an amateur commentator on their work. So let's hope all of this goes well. And with that, I invite Terri to take it away, please.
Thank you very much. I can use this one.
Yeah, wait to turn it on.
Okay. Thank you. All right, perfect. Well, this is going to go great. My
My name is Terri Friedline, and I'm pleased to present this collaborative work with my colleagues at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, Kimberly Hull, Carson Bollinger, and Anna Wood. We view questions of finance and of technology as a political project or as political projects that are occurring in the context of kind of rising fascism and white nationalism and white supremacy. And so this is sort of the perspective, some of the perspectives with which we approach our work. Oh, there it goes. Great. So one of the things that we contend in this project is that fintech or financial technology operates as invasive infrastructure. And we kind of draw some parallels to oil and gas pipelines in the context of this work, drawing on indigenous theories, indigenous scholarship to do so, and that it operates as this invasive infrastructure that connects marginalized and oppressed peoples to companies for predation and extraction. So this is part of the kind of big idea that we are, it's the headline that's up there kind of covered by some of the Zoom components, but that's totally fine because I've described what it is, but that's kind of the main point. Okay, a little harder. Okay. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk through some of the background of the research literature on fintech for financial inclusion, talk about indigenous theories of invasive infrastructure, go through, again, I'm talking about a specific research project kind of within the context of this work, go through the data, methods, findings, and then pose some questions for consideration. So there is a range of critical research literatures that review financial technology, including financial technology or fintech as a neoliberal approach to poverty reduction, so sort of banking the unbanked and including people in retail, basic, consumer retail financial products and services as a way to reduce poverty, kind of improve people's material conditions. There are also research literatures on financial inclusion and fintech that focus on surveillance, that expands the scope and the scale under which people are surveilled and kind of tracked and monitored. There are two concepts within these literatures that are useful for this current work. The one is predatory inclusion, and this is the idea of exclusion by inclusion. So the idea that groups of people who have historically been excluded are now included within financial products and services, but in so doing are exploited, as well as obfuscation, which comes from research on platform capitalism and digital technologies that suggests that the privatization of data obscures information that should be actually easy to access. So if we carry that first one forward, predatory inclusion, there's a range of marketing around fintech that talks about being able to include marginalized groups in basic financial products and services. So fintech for financial inclusion. These are headlines from news reports and other media over the last few years that kind of indicate that fintech is a way to improve inclusion in basic credit, bank account products and services in countries in Latin America and Africa, along the lines of banking the unbanked. And a specific example is a few years ago, Stuart Levy, who was the CEO of the DM project at the time, which has since been pared down and sold off, I believe, that he described DM as a way that was going to provide these really low-cost, highly secure transactions for the purposes of inclusion, so expand access to those who need it the most. And my colleagues and I realized that this could be an empirical question, one that we could kind of test systematically, the claims that companies make about their products and services, and the extent to which they include ideas of predatory inclusion and obfuscation and ideas around invasive infrastructure in their marketing. And this is kind of the project that I'm presenting that we've undertaken since then. Okay, there we go. No, it's fine. So I mentioned kind of infrastructure, and on our way toward an invasive theory of infrastructure, We are interested generally in metaphors that people use to describe fintech, finance technologies generally, and plumbing is a pretty common one. Heard plumbing over the last few days. Highways are also another metaphor, on-ramps and off-ramps to access to the financial system. Again, news headlines, comment from Mary Daly, president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve's kind of book or series of reports that talk about really fintech for financial inclusion that was released. One of us is also one of my co-authors. Also works as a literal plumber, and so we have many relationships to this metaphor in our work. We are kind of white settlers, and in our process of kind of learning from research and literature on infrastructure, we came to work with indigenous scholars who are writing about oil and gas pipelines as this invasive form of infrastructure. So Winona LaDuke and Deborah Cohen describe oil and gas pipelines as the contemporary spine of settler colonialism. So if you think of the image that was on the screen in the first few slides of the pipeline kind of snaking through the landscape, the geography, very visual sort of metaphor of this invasive type of infrastructure. And they describe it as a mechanism for dispossessing, for extracting, for accumulating wealth and resources, usually in the hands of white and wealthy elites. Some examples of this are described, as the stock market needs electricity in order to, kind of function and produce wealth, accumulate wealth for some. We also know that the construction sites where oil and gas pipelines are being built and constructed and worked on, that those are places of labor exploitation. Often there are men working at those labor camps, and the prevalence of workers, of men, is also related to the rise in violence against Indigenous women. So there are many ways in which these infrastructures are considered invasive. And so this is where we think predatory inclusion and obfuscation are mechanisms of this sort of invasive infrastructure, and what we set out to study in this project. I'm going to skip through a little bit of the details on our data and methods. We use data from Nexus Uni, which is one of the largest kind of databases for news and media research. And we are ultimately presenting on, what are 78 newswires and press releases from finance, technology, social media companies between 1995 and 2021. Happy to talk through the details of how we kind of narrow down from a much larger kind of corpus of newswires and press releases. But we're focused on the 78 because we really want to read in depth the words and the language that companies are using to talk about their products and services. So we want to explore through critical discourse analysis, which is the study of power in language and words, how predatory inclusion, obfuscation, and invasive infrastructure kind of appear or are surfaced in the words that companies use to really talk about themselves and their products and services. Part of this process includes literally reading through the newswires and press releases and coding. We code in a couple different levels. We'll be talking about the theoretical concepts that we draw from those today. So this is kind of our third level of coding. Before we get there, I just want to raise potential limitations of our approach. So one is, whether this is kind of overdetermined. Do we just choose a data set that's going to tell us what we think or what we expect to be happening anyway? Newswires and press releases, where companies are talking about their products and services, a sales mechanism in some ways. Another is whether or not these forms of corporate marketing can tell us anything new. There are many audiences for newswires and press releases. Some of those are which are shareholders, regulators, other companies are speaking to each other as well. And these newswires and press releases, and individual customers are just kind of one potential marketer audience here. But one of the reasons that we think this is important is because the newswires and press releases that companies are kind of issuing appear in news media, kind of reported on uncritically by journalists and news sources. So let's skip through this example. I'm going to share this example from Walmart. So this is a announcement from Walmart on one side, this is what the Newswire looks like, released in 2019, and they're talking about their remittance or money transfer services. They're upgrading these services. And on the other side is a news report from Business Insider. So essentially what happens is Walmart makes this announcement, November 4th, 2019. 2 days later, it's reported on in Business Insider. We have a number of these examples right across our data set where pretty much the news report, repeats verbatim, the language that's used in the corporate Newswire or the press release. Not any sort of, in this case in particular, not any sort of kind of critical analysis about what's happening in the context of Walmart's money transfer services, but simply just kind of repeating, making the Newswire part of the news in a kind of quote unquote objective sort of way. So in our third level of coding, our theoretical, our themes that we think have emerged include new products, old promises, benevolent exploitation, efficient obfuscation, and information extraction. And we have examples across the nearly 30 years of data, but I'm just going to give one example to highlight really the relevance of each of these. And so the first, new products, old promises, essentially is across time from 1995, which is really the early age of the internet and also online banking. Companies are making promises about greater control of finances, easy access. They're making those same promises in 1995 as they are in 2021. Iteratively, sometimes the same companies are making the same promises about new products. And in this case, this is a company called Online Resources that's announcing interbank transfer services. So now people can move money more easily between accounts across banks at different parts of the country, accounts at different parts of the country. And they promise greater control, greater flexibility, but this is, again, a target that is kind of always moving, never achieved. And benevolent exploitation, this is similar to an idea of predatory inclusion, where companies are advertising products and services benevolently, often using racialized and gendered terms to talk about how they're selling their products and services. One of these is an example from VB Token. There are actually many more examples of the ways that these play out in the Newswires and press releases. And the paper is available for you to read to find those. So I'm presenting probably what are some of the least controversial sorts of examples. And VB Token is one of those. They're a crypto company, and they're announcing plans to ask investors to invest in their product. The product that they intend to create is a cryptocurrency that's going to solve Brazil's kind of quote unquote problem of the unbanked. This is how they describe that. It's a benevolent service. We need lots of capital investments so that we can create this product, so that we can solve issues of financial access. Companies also hide information behind jargon and language of cost efficiency or effectiveness. In this case, a tech company called Valaro, that's headquartered in New York City, is launching a fraud protection program in South Africa. And I recommend the work of Dr. Joy Malala, who studies M-Pesa in Kenya and the regulatory context in which that M-Pesa has developed. Because one of the things that is happening in this case is that they're saying, things are changing rapidly, technology is changing rapidly, regulators need a hand in figuring out problems of fraud. Fraud is expensive for telecommunications companies, so we are going to provide this service, fraud protection. We're going to reduce fraud, and we're going to do so using this jargon, multi-factor authentication. But one of the things that is happening in this context is that it places the responsibility for fraud on the individual person, on the individual customer to authenticate a transaction that now could no longer be contested anywhere kind of in the system. Because you have authenticated it, it must be accurate and true, and so it cannot be kind of contested for repayment in other parts of the system, which really makes individuals kind of responsible for fraud, which is a systemic sort of problem. And I'm gonna wind up maybe in 2 minutes, maybe take an extra minute. And this last one, information extraction. Pinata is a company for renters and landlords, and they propose really advertising to renters, landlords, and investors in this same app, suggesting that if renters can add their payment information into this app, Pinata will report that to credit bureaus, and that will be a way for improving renters' credit scores and making the invisible visible in the credit system. But of course, this requires renters to give up personal information in order to participate. There's limited information in terms of the firewalls that are put in place between the renter and the landlord and the investor. Another part of the advertisement in this newswire is that landlords can leverage the credit of their tenants in their own sort of debt or credit-seeking endeavors. And this will make it easier for landlords to be able to do that. So, broad summary, we think that newswires and press releases can kind of illustrate these concepts of predatory inclusion and obfuscation and fintech as an invasive infrastructure. I'm going to skip through some of the other main summary highlights and leave with a few questions. So, given the opportunity to speak with many folks who are experts in this field or in these fields of work, we do have ideas for how this work can relate to theory, to policy, to action. But I thought I would just share some of the questions that we are considering about our own work and kind of our own critical thinking about this. One is, what we might have missed in our framework, what else might be obscured kind of in our own process of work and research by focusing on fintech as invasive infrastructure, what other patterns might we be able to look for and explore, what else can this framework reveal about power and how power is operating in the system, and how can companies' own language, these are things that companies are saying, kind of read critically, they're telling us who they are and what they're doing. Perhaps we could believe them kind of from the get-go, from the start. And so then how can these newswires and press releases, the language that they're putting out, be used proactively in the context of regulation and oversight? And so, thank you very much. And I will pass it to Sannoy, who will move us to our next panelist.
All right. Thank you, Terri. Invite David. David teaches at Georgetown. David teaches law. So, should have interesting things to say.
All right, well, thank you, Sannoy, for moderating the panel and for pulling together such great papers. Thanks also to Chris, Susan, and the entire MDM team for organizing this wonderful event. So this paper is about the role of technology in a part of the financial system. It's relatively disembedded in the Karl Polanyi sense from what you might call organic or folk social life, even really from transactions in the real economy. Instead, it focuses on the role of computer-mediated surveillance in the supervision of systemically important financial institutions, of the risks and movements of mobile capital through large dealer banks, basically, and their counterparties. It's very much a work in progress, so I'd love your comments, critiques, reading suggestions, all of it. In this talk, I want to do three things. First, highlight how datafication and computer mediation have transformed and are transforming the surveillance activities at the heart of financial supervision. Second, distinguish between two sources of surveillance. First, ambient or automated data collections, and second, active surveillance by a responsive actor, what the STS people call human in the loop. And then three, evaluate the role and limits of computer-mediated surveillance as a part of the larger financial supervisory project. So first, a word on the role of surveillance in financial supervision, and specifically of financial risk. So the project within which the surveillance I'm focusing on today is a small slice of the larger projects where surveillance is utilized and contested. So for example, Raul Carrillo will be presenting work tomorrow that gets at the stakes of technical decisions in the design of the digital dollar. I'm focused today on a part of the system where the privacy stakes are a little lower, but where the surveillance is still central to the governance of what Chris yesterday called the distribution of monetary resources in the form of rescues. So surveillance is a step in the financial supervisory process of ensuring the soundness of financial institutions that would receive those rescues from the Fed. So what do I mean by surveillance? In this context, I mean the use of any means to collect information about financial risk. So the first claim I'm going to make is about digital transformation. So surveillance has been around a long time in financial supervision. It's an important and key aspects of it don't need computers at all to happen. It's worth naming those as the foundation. So first, on-site examination. Examiners working within banks pour over files, engage in dialogue with bank personnel. Second, collection of periodic firm-produced reports. So obviously accounting techniques predate the computer. And so looking over such reports, what Henry Wu would call intermediary depictions, is a mainstay of supervision. And third, informal policing via social networks that operate across the public-private boundary. Conversations between agency personnel and bankers are kind of like local knowledge surveillance. You don't need computers to do that. So each of those three techniques are compatible with analog methods of surveillance, but there's been a transformation over the past few decades as financial transactions themselves have become increasingly datafied and datafiable. Surveillance too has gone digital. So now surveillance increasingly has the following characteristics. Collections are conducted by machine. They are ambient in nature. Collections are machine readable, they're datafied, so you can process them and conduct computer analyses on them. Third, information is increasingly granular, or what Henry Wu would call pure information. And then fourth, information is increasingly collected in continuous or near continuous processes. So these changes are enabled by technological advances, certainly, but they're chosen due, I argue, to a conception of surveillance that embraces those technological possibilities and goes towards what I would call the end of comprehensive surveillance. So this conception arose due to the coincidence of technological advancement and also a diagnosis of what went wrong in the global financial crisis. Specifically, in the eyes of leading policymakers and scholars, the crisis represented a failure of surveillance. In part, there are lots of other things going wrong. But not only did supervisors fail to prevent risky financial practices from causing the credit crisis, they failed even to see that some of those practices were taking place. And so technocrats emerged from that experience with the conviction that their regime should never be blindsided again. And so across jurisdictions and policymaking bodies, they pledged to fill every significant data gap and to engage in technologically sophisticated continuous monitoring of emerging risks. So after crises and failures, this is the vision that some leading policymakers call for. I think it has a kind of traces of the tech utopian rhetoric that Terri's paper identifies, but it's a public sector variant of that tech utopianism. So for instance, in 2014, former Bank of England chief economist Andrew Haldane described a system that he wanted. He wanted supervisors to be able to track the global flow of funds in close to real time from a Star Trek chair using a bank of monitors in much the same way as happens with global weather systems and internet traffic. So here's the second point that I want to make. I argue that this version of computer-mediated surveillance is really a false idol. On its own, it solves none of the problems with supervision. And further, within policy discourse, it often distracts from the real problems with surveillance and supervision. So to see that it's an attractive policy fix within discourse around surveillance, and consider how that discourse went after some recent scandals. The first that I'll talk about is the Archegos family office implosion in 2021, and the second is the recent failure of Silicon Valley Bank. So first, Archegos. This was a US-based family office. That's one person's dynastic wealth fund, and it was making large, concentrated, and highly levered bets on a handful of US equity securities. It did so via derivative contracts called total return swaps with a handful of global dealer banks, Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, and a few others. When the market went against its positions, those dealer banks had to scramble, first to demand collateral from Archegos, and second to sell the securities that they'd been holding as hedges for the transactions. And across all of Archegos' counterparties, there were over $10 billion in losses, $5.5 billion of which fell on Credit Suisse. So after all this happened, the surveillance discourse snapped into action. Policymakers and critics highlighted especially that the Securities and Exchange Commission had been tasked by US Congress in 2010 to construct 2 information infrastructure systems that should have, they thought, collected data on Archegos' risk. As a result of this discourse, we've seen 2 follow-on policy responses. One is a legislative effort to close the so-called family office exception to ambient surveillance of private fund activities like hedge funds, expand that to include family offices. And also we've seen the SEC redouble its efforts to construct a data repository for derivatives transactions like the ones Archegos involved in. Similarly, discourse on the heels of Silicon Valley Bank tended in the same direction. It's not the only policy response, but it's one of the policy responses. So in the words of a recent Brookings report, it would be great if we had a monitoring system with built-in processes that routinely collect, analyze, and interpret information in real time and provide early warnings about the health of regulated institutions. It would be great if we had a computer that did that. So I argue that these surveillance projects are at best woefully incomplete and at worst actively distracting from the real problems with surveillance and supervision that are raised by these episodes. So to make this argument, I want to draw a distinction between ambient and active surveillance. Ambient is the work of the information infrastructure like a data repository or the imagined real-time financial monitoring system. It does not require the eyes of a human supervisor in the loop. And the surveillance discourse has prioritized this kind of surveillance. By contrast, active surveillance is the work of human supervisors in the loop, who are empowered to analyze and respond with demands for action. Now, you could have a computer that's active, and I'd love to talk about that in the Q&A, but right now we're pretty far from, at least in the financial supervisory world, getting to that place. So at this point, I argue that active surveillance is the more important priority for a few reasons. First, it's essential. Ambient surveillance on its own does nothing. The link between observation and action at this point must route through a human in the loop to provoke action on the part of a supervised institution. Second, it's ambiguous whether more ambient surveillance information would be helpful given the current structure of the supervisory apparatus. This is a contingent claim, but right now, at most, ambient surveillance can only provide another possible source of data for active surveillance, and at worst, it contributes to info glut and inaction in the form of overanalysis. Third, at least as the cases of Archegos and SVB, more ambient information wasn't necessary. It's really true that the risks were hiding in plain sight. And so for those reasons, calls for amped up ambient surveillance are more likely to be distractions and false salves than valuable remedies. To see this, consider the Archegos case. While it's true that the Archegos trades were missing from SEC-constructed ambient information infrastructure, Archegos itself was hardly missing from the most important and obvious source of ambient computer-mediated surveillance, which are the bank's own risk management systems. So just to be clear, I'm not against ambient surveillance. I think it's great and helps supervisors do their work in this space. But we have a great source of information already. So at Credit Suisse, for instance, Archegos was in persistent, significant breach of some key internal risk limits. And according to pre-existing Federal Reserve guidelines, risk limits are supposed to be a key object of active, continuous monitoring by supervisors. So those supervisors, the active surveillance people, had access to the facts, for instance, that Archegos had been in breach of a bunch of limits for months prior to its default. But despite bright blinking red lights, it appears that no US supervisor actively observed them, let alone acted on them. So the culprits here, what gets in the way of effective active surveillance are jurisdictional fragmentation and desupervision at the Federal Reserve. So these are institutional problems, not technical ones. Credit Suisse fell within the Federal Reserve ambit for enhanced supervision due to the size and complexity of its US operations. But not only did the Fed miss the risks, then Vice Chair for Supervision Randall Quarles disavowed Fed responsibility for their oversight. In congressional testimony, he said, well, these transactions were booked in London, even though they were entered into in New York. So this was a questionable assertion as a matter of law and regulation. The Fed itself has stated that enhanced supervision is meant to encompass overall risk management of combined US operations, US broker-dealer activities at Credit Suisse with US clients, with derivatives referencing US issued securities are nothing, if not US operations. Further, as Professor Jeremy Kress has noted, Credit Suisse located Archegos risks in New York for purposes of the internal risk management function. And this function clearly falls within enhanced supervisory scope as a matter of regulation. But active surveillance did not live up to this mandate. A further potential contributor to this active surveillance blind spot was the Fed's 2020 decision to demote Credit Suisse from its large institution supervision coordinating committee. I feel like I should say LISC, given that we heard from somebody who used to work for LISC, and put it in its supervisory program to its large and foreign banking operation program. So it's unclear whether this demotion had material impact on surveillance at Credit Suisse. Quarles stated that Archegos losses could not have been picked up by LISC supervision, even if Credit Suisse had stayed in the program. So either this was false, and the demotion was determinative in basically getting in the way of successful active surveillance from Archegos being picked up, or it was true, and LISC itself was indeed incapable of surveilling transactions risk managed in New York but booked in London. In either version of events that Quarles put forth, Federal Reserve active surveillance missed a major New York-based threat to a systemically important bank's soundness. So to summarize, the Archegos case supports the idea that active surveillance of existing information sources is the most serious surveillance need within the system. The case also suggests that much of the call for more and better ambient surveillance neglects the stark fact that supervisors already had that excellent access to risk-sensitive, time-critical, computerized information that was flashing red. They merely failed to look. So one final note that kind of steps outside the frame of the surveillance discourse itself, and it's something that's been on my mind in light of Saleh's talk and Morgan Riggs's work, which is, what does it tell us about the future of financial regulation as a whole, that we even feel the need to be engaging in this level of complex, time-critical surveillance? One lesson, perhaps, is that we should see the waxing and waning of active surveillance effectiveness as something that we should, one, attempt to remedy, but two, also attempt to design around. That is, what kind of legal and regulatory regime we choose if we just assumed that there will be surveillance blind spots, that combination of ambient and active surveillance, especially during these supervisory waves, especially after a few years of relative calm, are going to have persistent holes. More and more, I think that the persistence and significance of those blind spots. Council's not in favor of redoubled datafication efforts because resources are scarce, but rather in favor of structural regulation that lessens the need for that time-critical surveillance in the first place. So with that, I'd love to talk it all over in the Q&A or the hallway afterwards.
Thank you. I have Anush next. I want to take a minute to introduce Kevin, who has joined just as you sort of get your presentation going. Kevin is an assistant professor at the Asian School of Business in Malaysia and a faculty fellow at MIT Sloan. He will be speaking after Anush. He will be joining us on Zoom. So yeah, Anush.
Hey, was this okay?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Sannoy, and thanks everyone for coming to the presentation. So this is a slightly different speech from the other two. This is a chapter from the forthcoming book, which is called Political Theory of Money. So I'm going to try and summarize that in one slide before I move on to the chapter. And it's a theoretical work, but so the first half is a bunch of theory in conversation with other theories, and then the second half has a series of case studies. And one of the big claims in the book is that one of the key sources, not the only source, but the key source of money's value is its nature as a kind of creditary claim on national wealth and future national wealth. Should I let this go?
No, I will do that.
Sorry. And this kind of claim-on-claim nature of money is run through what I call the fiscal monetary machine. So central bank liabilities, central bank money is backed by government debt. That's the asset on the central bank's balance sheet. Government debt in turn is backed by taxes, and taxes are of course claims on productive resources in an economy. And in that way, we can think of money as a kind of it's linked back to the real economy in a sense, not in a one-to-one sense, but it certainly is almost like a kind of equity claim on so equity without voting rights in a direct sense. Of course, taxes are meant to be exchanged for representation, but that's the link between money and value run through a few balance sheets. And it's a political theory because it wants to say that the best monies are an outcome of a mutualization of different kinds of balance sheets, of individual balance sheets, but they're mutualized both at scale, mutualizing as in a swap of IOUs, I'll go to that in a minute, but of a swap fortified by political relationships. And when you get the combination of very strong qualitative mutualization and political mutualization, and you get that at scale, you get balance sheets that are very robust. Not the state is not all states are able to achieve this, both in terms of the plumbing and in terms of the scale. China is very large, doesn't have the plumbing. Europe is very large, has a bit of the plumbing. The US has scale and the plumbing. The plumbing is of course highly politicized, and so that's how you get kind of a different sort of. It's an account of why you have hierarchy of money. We hear a lot about hierarchy of money, but why is the system hierarchical, right? It's a technical feature of the system, and this is one account to sort of one way to try and get at that hierarchy. It operates both at the sort of macro and micro level, because this is a kind of run through this macro political settlement. That has a bearing on how the plumbing is configured, how the institutional plumbing is configured. But there's also, of course, a micro politics of this in terms of market microstructure, designing bond markets, designing money markets, and so and variability in how different political settlements at different scales then get anchored into wherein Roberto Hongo's law school, so people are familiar with the idea of institutions as frozen politics. These congeal in different ways at micro and macro levels, and then give us a kind of an account of variety and therefore hierarchy of money. And they also, because of the centrality of money to any economy, allow us in some sense to tell macro stories about how crisis develops, how economic growth or economic stagnation happens, so on and so forth. So that's a very a quick summary of the entire book. This is one chapter, is one small kind of theoretical element of money that I wanted to focus on for the purposes of conversation here, and that is why does credit money, a promise, and IOU function like it's a commodity with value? How does it get away with this? How does it do this? So that's what I'm going to try and answer. First, why does this matter? It matters, of course, for the acceptability of money, and it matters for the theory of the commodity fetish from Marx is that commodities sort of it's not an obfuscation, it's a kind of relationship that is necessary, that it comes along with the commodity. There's something in the nature of commodity production that generates a commodity fetish simultaneous with commodity production, and that lends itself to kind of nationalization of the system, and that is, of course, obviously, in a sense, it doesn't allow us to understand the system. And economics kind of, falls into this trap of then therefore becoming a science of quantities and velocities, and we talk about this thing called fiat money as if it's a kind of thing as opposed to a kind of relation. But money is a social relation, and we need a kind of social science adequate to that. Thinking about the monetary economy, I think it's very important. This is, it's a little bit there in Keynes, but certainly not there in good old Marx. That a monetary economy is a kind of ontologically distinct thing from a barter economy. But of course, our models of economics is filled with thinking about the economy as a barter system, or we talked about fiat money. And I want to say that this is not entirely wrong in the sense that it's the misrecognition of money as fiat, or the misrecognition of money as a kind of commodity, is indexing this fetishized element in the system which is kind of generated. So that's the why question. We all know the idea of Marx is commodity fetish, very briefly. The idea is that it's basically social relation in Marx's case of producing commodities out of social division of labor that's exploitative. A social relation is taking the form of a necessary form of appearance as a thing. So commodities, we make them collectively, but they appear to us as sort of autonomous from us. And the money fetish in Marx is just a kind of version of the commodity fetish because, of course, he has a commodity theory of money. I want to have a slightly different approach to this, which is that the money fetish is a necessary effect of a sort of socio-institutional process by which promises are made, and it's a variable process. This can be done more or less, by which promises are made to function like valuable things. And this process is called banking. And I use the term mutualization to mean this process whereby IOUs are swapped a more creditworthy balance sheet bank. Swaps, this is what happens, of course, in the creation of a loan, where the more creditworthy balance sheet gives the borrower an IOU, which is the bank's liability, and the borrower gives the bank an IOU saying, I'll pay you back. And this process, what the distinction, of course, between banking and money lending is that, banking is not money lending. Money lending is I have money and I have money. Banking is accepting the individual's creditworthiness and replacing the individual IOU with the social ledger IOU, bank money, well, which is of course a promise to pay an even higher version. Right? And so this is mutualization because the bank is taking on the solvency risk of the borrower, right? And it's replacing its own balance sheet, and it's saying, my IOU is not socially legible, I can't use it in society, but if my IOU is stamped by a bank, it says, accept this person's IOU, if I'm good for it, right? So that's the accepting of this. This is on scale, so you have a kind of socialization process here. This occurs in several different ways in the credit system, and I go through all of them in the papers available in the repository. I'm just going to talk about one today in the interest of time, but this happens, to my mind, in at least 4 ways in the banking process. And I'm really just going to talk about the first one, which is hierarchy. One person's credit, one level's credit or inside money, one level up in the system, functions as another unit's outside money. So I'll go into that in some detail. The second way this occurs is that we talk about depositing money in a bank as if it's we have this physicalist language for something that's actually a social relation, right? When we deposit money in a bank, it's as if we're putting some money thing in some building. But of course, we are engaging in a lending relationship to the bank. The bank owes us that money back on demand. System-wide flows of liquidity, right? The money that comes out of the ATM takes the form of appearance of physical bank stocks in localized hoards, and of course that's true to some extent, but because of fractional reserve, we know it's not one-to-one. In fact, there are interbank relationships going back and forth. promises to pay cash, so it's a kind of, I use the Chinese room metaphor here, where a flow is appearing as a stock. And then lastly, of course, credit creation. It's as if we're lending out some hoarded money that we have in the back room, or the bank has, but in fact, it's generating IOUs against itself that then can be paid for money later. So and this is the nature of credit money. So for some credit, some IOUs are so good that they can function as money, right? So promise to pay gold. If it's asymptotically, if this promise is extremely good, it can basically be as good as gold, right? So that's in that way, the promise comes to function as the thing is promising. If money is a debt settling instrument, money is that. This is one sort of a good old banking school definition of what money is. If money is a debt settling instrument, for a credit instrument to function as a debt settlement instrument between transacting parties, that credit has to be by definition outside those parties, right? I can't settle a debt with you with my IOU. That's just rolling over the debt. If we have to settle a debt between us, and we're going to use a credit instrument to do that, it has to be by definition the credit instrument of some third party, right? It can't be one of our own credit instruments, because that's of course the trick of the exorbitant privilege, is that the US's liability, the US's IOU is money. So it blends together payment and taking on a loan. But for normal balance sheets, this is not the case. So it has to be outside the transacting parties, right? And as such, because it's outside, in order for me to settle that debt, or one of the transacting parties to settle that debt, they have to acquire that credit, that IOU. Either there's only two ways to acquire it. You either earn it by selling labor power or engaging in business or something, or you borrow it, right? In other words, even though ontologically, this is what Minsky calls the survival constraint. All economic units have to source money from somewhere to kind of meet their survival constraints, because capitalism is cash access. Now that means that even though credit money is ontologically a promise, right? In its kind of ontological essence, it's a promise to pay something. Because it is a third party instrument, because it's outside the transacting parties, it takes on the look and feel of a commodity. It may as well be a commodity, because I have to either borrow it or earn it in order to settle debts in it, right? So this is what I mean by outsideness confers thingness. It's functional commodification, even though it's ontologically a kind of right. It's outside me, especially for, so if A is survival constraint, some unit A is survival constraint can be relaxed by C's IOU, then C's IOU is as if it's gold to A. It may as well function like a commodity, right? And this is of course asymmetrical. This is how C is higher up the credit hierarchy than A. So you get this kind of definition of hierarchy as a chain of interlocking inside and outside monies, where bank money is banks' own money. If you create it, if you just expand its balance sheet, that's how banks get, right? That's how banks issue money. But to us, bank money is money, right? It's outside. It's not our IOU. It's the bank's IOU. Similarly for banks, central bank money is outside money to the banks, but it's inside money to central banks. US dollars are inside credit to the Fed, but outside credit to all of us, right? So the outsideness is functional thingification. Credit money is endogenous to the issuer and exogenous to everyone. This exogeneity creates a kind of fetish that covers over the social relational nature of credit money, thereby turning a promise into a thing. But this is a variable process, right? This can be overextended. Banks can overextend themselves. Countries can overextend themselves. Central banks can overextend themselves. This is a deeply politicized process. This is not just a technocratic process. This is happening in the teeth of a kind of political struggle. So if mutualization is poorly done or damaged or abused, then this kind of promissory element, right? This is a dynamic cyclical thing. The promissory element bleeds back through the kind of money fetish, and the sort of the magic wears off, and promises are mere promises. Yeah. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
And here's what. All right, wonderful. Thank you, Anush. I now invite Kevin for about 15 minutes.
All right, hey, can you all hear me?
I don't think we can hear you.
You can't? Okay. Oh no. Can you hear me now? It's working on my end.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. How about now?
Great.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, sorry.
wait, sorry, you can or you can't hear me? Okay, great. I see the thumbs up. Thank you very much.
You're a little loud.
Okay, I didn't hear that, but I assume it was funny. So hey, thanks for putting this together, Sannoy, and I have to in advance give you my apologies. I didn't send you this paper to review, or anyone for that matter, because it is still very much a work in progress. I hope to have time to finish it before today, to the point where I'm not embarrassed to share it, but that didn't happen. But the ideas are developing, and I hope to have some help with some of them. There's still some things I'm really struggling to work out. Okay, enough of the excuses. So the basic goal of this paper is to explore how consideration of dollar dominance is missing from international economic law, and why it should not be missing. So that's important because, well, at least I think it's important through an exploration of how dollar dominance interacts with and quite often undermines the theoretical justifications for, if not the practical implementations of, the policy goals of international institutions. IMF, World Bank, the Bank of Investment Settlements. I go through quite a few of them. I'm not going to do that all in 15 minutes, but it's interesting to see how lack of consideration of dollar dynamics interact with the formulas that they use. In setting out the problem, I kind of frame it around the idea of public interest. So it explores in a first part three aspects of the dollar's prominence and dominance, which I won't explain right now. In the international finance and economic system, before suggesting that international economic legal theory, insofar as it concerns the idea or the concept of public interest, really fails to account for the medium through which international economic activity most often takes place. So that's why I call the paper Missing the Medium. Public interest means different things in different spheres of law, domestic and international. So for central banks, it means economic stability and coordination with whatever government's broader policy goals. For international investment arbitration, it often means an exception to general rules that are ordinarily intended to protect capital or assets of foreign investors, often private ones, not always. For international financial institutions, it often means the conditions under which certain economic development goals can be justifiably executed. But in reality, it only really considers one goal, or dominantly considers one goal, or at least only considers one goal legitimate, in my reading anyway, and that is the goal of increasing production. And for international monetary institutions, it means transparency and risk abatement guidelines for the central banks and economic policymakers of individual states. And that's one of the big problems, that it doesn't there's nothing that adequately concerns the systems of multiple banks or overlapping systems of multiple banks. So how the dollar interacts with all of this, and how dollar dominance interacts with all of this. The dollar remains the invoicing currency. Something like 90% of trade takes place in international trade takes place through the dollar. So it is de facto the trade financing currency. because it is the global currency of both banking and finance, when dollars become more expensive relative to other currencies, international capital leverage decreases for other currencies. So, and rising interest rates attract investment at the same time away from risky developing markets and toward the stable returns of US bonds. Another section here tries to show that since monetary policy doesn't tighten of other states, doesn't tighten lockstep with the Federal Reserve, the US Federal Reserve, but kind of reacts to it as the interest rate gap widens, there's disproportionate impact on bilateral exchange rates. So currencies that react to the dollar depreciate disproportionately to the dollar's appreciation. And then there's a large section on the dollar's status as a safe haven currency. And I've decided to skip over that for this presentation. But it's another one of the main kind of aspects of its dominance. What I want to kind of talk about in more detail is just these different the theoretical justifications behind some of the international economic legal institutions. So in classical international economic law, like going way back, it had mercantilist roots, and then later came the chartalist theories of money that most contemporary policy is a bit more aligned with. I think it's important to remember that state-centered theories of money developed, or not all of them, but largely developed after Smith and Ricardo and Marx and others were writing. So many of those voices are still, highly influential, if not codified in international economic law. When I say codified, I'm thinking of, the WTO and Ricardo. And most of these writers were focusing on, theories of value and profit in terms that either assumed or sought to establish a fixed common medium of exchange to underpin, for the purpose, not in the real world, but for the purpose of underpinning arguments about value and profit and advantage. More generally, that is to say, they wanted to articulate generally applicable rather than provincial arguments. So each theory required some medium to measure what was put forward as explanations of value or profit in order to translate state and individual goals into policy, both domestic and international policy. And I think Anush's book sounds really quite interesting, and I hope it comes out soon so I can read it, because it sounds like some of it will be informative to what I'm working on here. But so some quick examples. So do I have time for those? Maybe not. So yeah, Smith, Ricardo. I won't go into those. I'll get to we'll come back to trade in a second, but I want to get to international investment law, because I think there is no real cohesive theory of international investment law, except for potentially contract theory. Its interpretation is unofficially based on a hybrid of customary international law and private international law. I think something interesting about international investment law, theoretically, with its kind of ambiguous theoretical justification, there's an argument about customary international law and public international law more generally being reliant on these, or not an argument, but kind of like a general knowledge that they're heavily reliant on the concept of first principles as articulated in general principles of international law. So I think Duncan Kennedy has offered a really striking explanation of the historical critique that led to this process of how those general principles become general principles. He was just talking about U.S. law, but I'll kind of adapt it specifically to international economic law like so. Early international economic law reacted to the theories of early economists, which were themselves reacting to or seeking to explain various economic phenomena that they saw out in the world, international and domestic, and often in a very highly ideological manner. So I'm thinking here of Hayek and Mises, and the earlier you go in these once famed economic writings, the more ideological the work gets. And the argument that Kennedy puts forward is that lawyers made law kind of reacting to those ideological interpretations and goals. And I've seen the same thing, especially with Mises and Hayek in international economic law and trade law and investment law in particular. Then in the early to mid 1900s, legal theory as a kind of, profession or a field begins to flourish, and the theorists of that day took it upon themselves to induce first principles from the laws that happened to be the case at the time. They just happened to exist. They're very, but this kind of historical contingency wasn't so deeply considered. And they were fragmented bodies of law based on ideological reactions, in a sense, to economic life, primarily as experienced in Germany and Austria, the UK, and then later the US. And the lawyers, you like one in particular I'm thinking of with WTO law is Ulrich Peterson, Hans Ulrich Peterson. I forget his first name. Maybe Hans. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. These lawyers, influential lawyers in the construction of these bodies of law, assumed without much historical inquiry that there must be essentially unifying principles behind what existed. And so induced first principles from those and then deduced new rules from those inductions. So in a sense, it's deducing commonality based on fictional general principles or first principles. So all of that's bubbling in public international law and customary international law, informing the makeup of international investment law, accompanied with the idea that public international law, rather than private insurance or other insurance measures, should be applicable to disputes involving states and the resources available to their publics. A dominant justification, and this is kind of what I wanted to get to here, is a justification I've noted across the board for international investment law as a system is the idea of risk, the concept of risk, and the public good associated with alleviation or righteous allocation of risk. Tisk. So I would say that risk is on some level kind of always in a dialectical engagement with law. At least it's easy to conceptualize its relationship to law as two sides of a process of imagining futures and using regulation to distribute rights and duties and responsibilities and costs and benefits and so on. So with international investment law, risk management seems to be the primary justification, and fictional principles govern its implementation primarily. I call them fictional principles. I know that's a bit cheeky. So let me, oh man, I have a lot I want to get to, but I'll skip over a lot of it. So I'll just say quickly, enter central banks, domestic central banks. And I'll just say, they have this public service mandate, right? Stability mandate, which is about stability and service to the public. The US Federal Reserve has a special role in the world. Other major economies, their central banks have special roles in the world, but none so special as the US Federal Reserve. For reasons I've already outlined. And the UNCTAD's 2022 Trade and Development Report also highlights several of those ways in which the US has a special role. The point is that the situation that it's in gives de facto authority to the Fed, de facto authority to determine quite a bit of non-US centric or non-US domestic policy. So it, among other things, it does that through just allocation decisions, just in quotations, that is like where and how to allocate liquidity, for example. And that authority extends to the policy decisions of central bankers the world over indirectly. I wanted to go through these, the actual models that the World Bank and the IMF use to measure in one case to determine what kind of financial assistance is needed in a given country, and in another to develop a program for economic intervention. But I don't have time do those justice right now. So what I'll say is that both of the models assume a lot and exclude a lot to the point where so in the case of the World Bank, the rationale is that, I think in both is that you have to have kind of a consistent thing that you can apply across the board. And then you have different variables that you put into an equation, and you take something, whether it's some kind of assumption about full production or any number of assumptions about how an economy works. You attach it to a number, and then you plug that into this equation, and then the equation spits out what is needed. But a lot of the assumptions just aren't warranted. In the World Bank, the most flagrant examples of that have to do with assumptions about what will happen if a government decreases taxation and puts more money into the pockets of private individuals in the private sector. There's kind of a generalized assumption that greater excess capital means more investment, and there's a lot of work that shows that isn't necessarily always the case, or isn't ever the case all of the time. So that's one there. The IMF also, I guess I won't really get into that one because it's a bit more long to explain. And the Basel Committee, the Basel frameworks, Basel III. These are so this is like in contrast to the other things, they're process rather than rule based. So so that I think is actually, in my opinion anyway, kind of a good step, a good way to conceptualize dealing with like a global economic policy that takes into account all these kind of different fragmented interests. But yeah, I have a critique of the way that they do it that I won't share right now. So I'm still working out a way to properly articulate the theoretical contradictions that emerge from all of these different bodies of law. But I'll finish with a basic lay of the land as I see it. There are central banks that are focused on short-term domestic stability. There's the BIS focused on, and the Basel Committee focused on international banking processes, capital and liquidity requirements, prevention of contagion, that kind of thing. The World Bank, which is focused on financing development as determined by production. The IMF focused on monetary policy in relation to development goals as determined by assumptions on private and public disposable income, currency valuation, and savings. There is the legacy of absolute advantage and natural value at the WTO's wholesale adoption of comparative advantage without really considering Ricardian theories of labor that underpinned it. All of these regulatory bodies are focused on a small part of a highly complex system, obviously, but most of them are forward-looking in the sense that they focus to greater or lesser degrees on mitigation or prevention. So anything associated with risk can be thought of, in my view anyway, as a forward-looking category. Most of those are forward-looking that I've mentioned. The WTO, by contrast, is kind of backward-looking. Did discrimination occur? Did an exception apply? Was Marrakesh provision breached? None of the institutions, with the possible exception of BIS, account for the dollar's role in generating and mitigating long and short-term risk, and none of them account for the dollar's role in discrimination. Discrimination between exchange is sanctioned, but when the Fed centers policy on short-term needs of the US economy and when other central banks are required to adapt to that at the expense of their respective publics, their governments are prevented from adopting alternative policies on imports and exports that could promote domestic production, that could achieve the goals that those institutions purport to be trying to achieve. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right. We're going to go about 10 minutes past the hour. And I'm going to keep sort of comments really short over here. You don't, you can take them down and not respond to them if you don't have to. I guess with Terri, I would say that, Terri asked two questions for the audience. I guess one is that what does this kind of reading of fintech as invasive infrastructure do for policy, and what does it do for theory? Now, I have a provocational theory, I guess, for you to consider, which is that, it seems to me that the argument is very consistent Sorry.
Too loud.
Oh, okay. It seems to me that the theory is consistent with the notion that primitive accumulation is a perennial condition of capitalism, and at some point of time, or at all points of time, there has to be some amount of dispossession for capitalism to function. The interesting question that your paper had raised, which you didn't touch upon in your presentation, perhaps might be useful to think of, is that there is a correlation between infrastructure being invasive and being deemed therefore critical. Pipelines have to be protected by the power of the state. How much does fintech lay claim to that? How much does that invasive infrastructure lay claim to the protection of the state in order for it to sort of truly match this paradigm of invasive infrastructure? Because, with any Marxist, the argument would be that if it is primitive accumulation, it always needs powerful state backing. And so there's the question of theory that I think if we worked out, we'd actually be able to do the policy much better. With David, I'd say that I was interested in sort of this conceptual difference between sort of ambient and active surveillance, because the word surveillance as a sort of act of discipline always sort of conjured the image of ambience rather than activity, because activity is the act of sovereignty, and sovereignty is sort of the act of political decision, and that has to necessarily come at a sort of, in a theoretical sense, after surveillance, and or the exception to surveillance, because surveillance by very existence is supposed to discipline. What you're asking for is active surveillance, but what you're really asking for is political decision on discipline rather than surveillance-based discipline. So I think there's a deeper paradigm shift that you're pushing towards, which is that we have to actually look beyond surveillance, and you're still couching it sort of in the language of surveillance. And that seemed to me to be a theoretical point or a conceptual point to resolve if you were to take this sort of argument forward. To Anush, I'd say, Anush had a degree in anthropology, and as an anthropologist, one of the great things is you take a fetish seriously instead of trying to strip it down and see what's behind the fetish in some way. Because the state too is a fetishized form of underlying social relations. We have to forget that there are sort of humans in political community to think of the state as a state. And so what do we gain by sort of pointing to the loss of sort of correlation between signifier and signifying? By doing the stripping down, what is it that we are getting at? What I found interesting, of course, about your work is the claim that, well, this money fetish is important for capitalist democracy to function. But which of these two prongs needs the fetish to sort of hold tight strongly? Is it capitalism or is it democracy? And in one way, of course, your argument runs into, or we'll have to at some point in time disagree with the opposite notion that what banks do is franchise the public the full faith of the sovereign, right? If banks franchise the full faith of the sovereign, then that's a top-down way of money creation, which you're sort of, which the claim of money fetish runs sort of against. And so, if you could sort of explain that theoretical difference a little bit better, because there's there's obviously considerable overlap, and I guess just keeping with the notion of fetish, money seems to me to be the mana of mass society in some way, the mana of capitalist society. We need to sort of worship, and we find sort of collective community around our currency in some way. If the fetish was to be robbed of its fetishistic character, what would it do to political community is, I guess, is a question. And finally to Kevin, I guess one of the points that I disagreed with, and I understand that this paper is at a very draft stage, but is the notion that international economic law actually has anything to do with codifying classical political economy. I feel like it has very little. What it has something to do with codifying is sort of some old version of political liberalism that commerce breeds peace between nations. It has, it is true that neoliberals like Ernst Peter Schmann swear by Hayek, but the law reflects very little of those premises. What the law really reflects is some old notion that if we could sort of keep the wheels of investment and trade moving, then people would go less to war with each other. How much does taking dollar dominance into account sort of move that principle around? I think would be an interesting question, because I think it's fair to suggest that taking account dollar dominance will disrupt classical theories of political economy. But I guess I'm not sold on the notion that international economic legal theory actually has that much to do with classical political economy. It's sort of put out in textbooks saying that, well, this trade comparative advantage, therefore international trade law. But the legal foundations seem much more oriented in sort of Ducommun's Montesquieuan theory rather than classical political economy. But you could of course disagree with that, and that would be a good conversation. All right. So 4 questions, one for each of you. If you want to take like a minute responding to that, and then we open up, or if you want, we can just open up. You get more comments that way. So up to you.
Should I? You might use the mic.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So do you want to take questions, or do you want to take a stab at it?
Well, how do you do that?
We have about 15 minutes to go.
Well, I'll just say I appreciated your point about the infrastructure and the power of the state. And we'll look forward to expanding that part of the work.
I guess I'll say, I didn't mean to draw, so I appreciate your comment, and I think you're right about the essential role of discipline coming from the human supervisor in the loop. Terminologically, I think I should maybe think about just switching over to the word monitoring, so I don't draw in any sort of strong form Foucauldian notion of ambient discipline, because I think that that's not really doing much work. At least I'm becoming increasingly skeptical that, for instance, SEC gathering of information about derivatives contracts is going to do any of that kind of disciplinary work.
I'll just respond very quickly. Thanks for the question. One general point, black boxing is functional to things operating in a complex society, right? So, or even just with complexity. I don't, if I'm, this is a kind of almost like a Heideggerian point. I mean, things have to be in the ready-to-hand dimension if they're always, or present-to-hand dimension, if we, or whatever the daily one is. The analytical one is we can't be in that register, we can't live in that register. We can't use the plumbing and think about how the plumbing works at the same time. We have to use it or think about it. When it breaks, that breaks down. So money, so the fetish in money is functional in that way, is that it covers over the relational aspect. And if we were to meditate on the relational aspect, it may break down a bit more, or it may not. We may also just end up growing up and realizing that, listen, to say money is a social relation is not to say it's substantial. It's the contrary. It's to say that these social relations are of such a tensile strength, right? They are so well institutionalized in ideal type that they can in fact function like a thing, right? That's the point. There's a materiality to social relations, and so it's trying to communicate that point as well. And not that, and that we should sort of, not that this is sort of, knowledge for some cognoscenti sort of technocracy. This should be common knowledge, right? And precisely because then we can use money more generally. The citizenry can think about using money as a kind of, as a social institution that it is. So it's not meant to, it's an analytical point about how this black boxing happens or not. But then there's also a kind of a sort of a normative point to it as well.
Hey, I think we could have an interesting conversation on all of this. I'm not sure. Oh, I assume it's my turn to speak. There was a pause. Okay, yeah, great. I guess my point. I wasn't really trying to say that international economic law in general, trade, investment, so on, is codifying classical political economy. I think in the case of Ricardo with the WTO, That is in fact true. That but that's a long story, and it goes back way further than the Marrakesh Agreement. It goes back to like the 1850s, and Bowring, John Bowring, the first disciple of free trade, and John Stuart Mill and Ricardo all sharing an apartment together, and mulling over these ideas, and then occupying really high positions in empire, starting opium wars and such. Anyway, but I think I think we could debate a lot about Ricardo, but I think you're maybe right about the rest of it. Does it codify? Are we codifying Hayek? Or yeah, sure, some people were obsessed with Hayek, Pearsman and others. And maybe it provided kind of a rationale, but the deeper root of the international economic system isn't about Hayek. It goes back to, if I understand you correctly, you're referring to like the super old guard of like Grotius and Victoria and all those folks way back in the day. But just for the sake of argument, I would suggest that those at least what I know about some of what they said as justification for rationale for the kinds of law that they were teaching, trade law that they were teaching, or law of the sea that they were teaching,